The Kansas City Royals are one of those teams in the AL Central you can never put your finger on. But with guys like Vinny Pasquantino, Bobby Witt, the young core is here. Let's talk about all here on the Route Report episode of the OK Baseball Podcast. Welcome into another episode of the Route Report from the OK Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Rao, and we have another team preview for you as we are in the thick of it now. Spring training is here, and what a better way to start the AL Central, in my mind, since you've been paying attention to this podcast feed now, and you know that I am an Old Dominion alumni with a nice team that has a couple Old Dominion guys on there, a new one and a young one that is going to be some very fun, exciting players this year. What another great way to join me this year is Kevin O'Brien. Kevin, you can find him on Twitter at The Royal Report Kev. He's also has a fantastic website, The Royal Reporter. I love it. It's just fantastic. Kevin, welcome back for another year to talk Kansas City Royals. How's it been, my friend?
Hey, thanks a lot, Christian. And, it's been a really interesting offseason. And I know that the Royals, just as a small market club, didn't make a huge splash beyond the hiring of their new manager and the new coaching staff. But I think if you ask really any hardcore Royals fan who's been paying attention to this team closely, I think there's a lot to be excited about, even though it might take another year or two before we start to see major changes in the win column. So I think we're hopeful. The spring training has been going well so far with a 3-0 record. Of course, that doesn't really mean anything at this time of the year, but at the very least, it seems like there's some positive things going to be worth watching.
I mean, I feel like 3-0 record, you might as well just bank the World Series championship now. I'm sure those odds are going to be a negative sign soon if you don't get your money in quick. So, no, I'm with you. I love the fact that they're starting off really successful, especially because it's just an amazing youth movement here. We're definitely going to talk about that here on the show. But before we get into this season and really preview what to expect from the Kansas City Royals this year, I always like to just kind of take a look back and look at last season. 2022 for the Royals, as you mentioned, 65-97. That was last place in the AL Central by one game behind the Detroit Tigers. It caused for some big changes to happen. Obviously, a new manager coming in this season with the firing of Matheny. Obviously, a lot of things going in not the right direction for Kansas City. They move on for some players at the deadline. They do basically go for a big sale. The ones that you were expecting at one point to finally go with Merrifield, Michael A. Taylor, Andrew Benintendi finally get shipped off. What was your thoughts about last year if you're putting it all together? How do you feel about 2022 in a Royals perspective?
I think it was disappointing for sure, but I think it was necessary. I think it kind of forced, ownership to kind of rip the Band-Aid off in a bit of a way. The Royals have always kind of been one of those teams since kind of 2017 that have kind of been kind of treading water, being good enough to not be in last place, but still not really going anywhere. And in last year, we saw the regression, a lot of their core players. We saw Whit Merrifield starting to regress. Andrew Benintendi was great, but it was obvious that he was not looking to stay in Kansas City long term. And we saw a lot of those young pitchers that they invested a lot of draft capital in starting in 2018, really not, stepping up or really progressing with the exception of Brady Singer. And that was a concern because it's like the Royals felt what was going to turn them around was their homegrown pitching, and it wasn't happening last year. And there was a big report from The Athletic that came out that the Royals were really behind in terms of their pitching development, both at the major league and minor league level. And I think owner John Sherman, who bought the club shortly before the pandemic in 2019, kind of said, hey, we need a change. And I think that showed this offseason by letting go of Matheny, letting go of Dayton Moore, getting rid of all those veteran players. So it was tough to live through 65 wins, especially after winning 74 in 2021. But it did expedite the process of kind of bringing in the youth movement, which is necessary.
I find it crazy, and I think this is a stat or however you want to call it. It's just a crazy moment for the owner buying a team a year before COVID. I mean, a team that has had some success in this century. Obviously, 2015 was a great year for the Royals, or 2014. I'm sorry, correct me if I'm wrong what that year was, but and then you go and buy this team right before the COVID pandemic happens. That's obviously going to put a damper in how you feel about this team. But it seems like now, a couple years after being removed from that new honeymoon feeling, if you will, if that was even the case after the pandemic, it looks like things are starting to take shape, and it looks like the guys that he wants are going to be in those spots. And that starts off with a new manager, a new skipper, if you will, and that's Matt Cutaro. We're talking about how to actually pronounce his last name at the beginning of the show, because I guess a lot of people just call him Q. I've heard him a few times on some interviews of SiriusXM, but not much. So take me through, what do you think about this new manager for the club with a lot of young players? That's a big deal. It's a really big position to fill. Leadership, mentorship, that's a huge thing. What do you think about this guy taking charge of your clubhouse?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things about Q is not so much necessarily, he's not necessarily the most charismatic guy. He's not going to be like a Matheny or even Pedro Grifol, who got hired in Chicago. He's not going to be as charismatic as those two. But one of the things that you always get from him is he's very modern, and that comes from being a bench coach for the Tampa Bay Rays. And he is going to be the kind of manager that's going to find the right staff, and he's going to delegate those responsibilities to make sure that those staff are in the position to succeed. And I think that was one of the biggest problems under Matheny. Matheny was kind of old school in that way. I know Matheny had talked about embracing analytics, but it sounded like from reports that was kind of more window dressing and not so much, if you look deeper into the staff, that really wasn't the case. We've seen that he has a lot more specialization Q has brought to the coaching staff. They've added an assistant pitching coach, what they haven't had before. They've had an infield coach specifically. So they've gotten rid of these general bench coaches, or these general just coaches in general that have all these multiple roles, and kind of having more that's like, hey, this is specifically what we're doing. And I think that's the biggest thing he's bringing that technology, bringing in the specialized coaching staff. And because I think that's something general manager JJ Picollo has really been pushing for. He was one of the ones that kind of oversaw the hitting development starting in 2019. They saw some of those gains. And owner John Sherman says, hey, we have the technology. We're investing in the technology, but if we're not utilizing it, we need to find people who can. And that's something Q obviously brings from his time in Tampa Bay and his assistant coaching staff, especially assistant pitching coach Brian Sweeney, who comes from Cleveland, and kind of brings that very heavy analytical approach when it comes to pitching development.
You bring in some big guys from successful organizations like Tampa Bay, who have really flipped this league upside down with how they handle business. And then Cleveland, what they've done with their youth movement, obviously getting themselves to the playoffs. And that's a fantastic thing to do with a team that's striving to do the same in Kansas City. This breath of fresh air. Do you see this change of pace? Obviously, do you see a step forward for this organization compared to what management and what general management was a year prior, looking forward to 2023 and beyond?
I think so. And one of the things that has really been resonating is that it seems like there's been a lighter clubhouse in this spring training. And you can always read through the lines, right? So when they're saying, hey, the clubhouse is more relaxed, hey, the clubhouse, there's more talking going on. That was kind of a reputation that kind of dogged Matheny back in St. Louis, was that he kind of ran an intense, tight clubhouse. And Matheny wasn't alone. I know Cal Eldred, the former pitching coach, had that reputation of kind of being kind of standoffish and abrasive at times, whether it was with players or media or other coaches. And that's kind of been it kind of feels like it's taken a 180 since then. And so I think that the clubhouse in that format is good. I think it's good, especially with so many young players. It's allowed young players to really shine and show their leadership and their character, which I think is always important. But I also think it's going to be a clubhouse too, where people can kind of come in and they can kind of benefit from the positive culture, which I think is really needed, especially after a team that hasn't had a winning season since the World Series in 2015.
Oh, right. Yeah, I'm with you. Let's talk about this youth movement as we keep talking and alluding to it over and over again. If you look at the majority of the players who are in the projected lineups, if you want to look at Fangraphs, for example, with the exception of Salvador Perez, who seems ageless, and Hunter Dozier, who is a lot of things are trending forward. It seems like he might get his things together. I've been reading a lot of articles based on him. Really excited to see what Dozier can do this year. I'd like to get your thoughts on that in a moment. But you see guys like Vinny Pasquantino. Got to start off with him. Bobby Witt Jr., MJ Melendez, Kyle Isbell. There's a lot of really interesting players on this list that can really, I mean, I don't think their ceiling has even been met yet. And we're getting into maybe their second full seasons in the major leagues. Let's start off with Vinny Pasquantino, because as somebody who loves Old Dominion baseball, him coming from Old Dominion, and what he has done at the minor league level. And then last year, just his coming out party at Kansas City was absolutely electric. I came out on a show, one of our flagship shows last week, and I said it, a hot take, and I'll say it right here since we're going to have Royals fans listening. I believe Vinny Pasquantino is going to win the American League batting championship this year. I think it's going to happen. So what's your thoughts on Vinny P for his second season? No sophomore slumps, so I don't want to hear that.
And that's been one of the most amazing things about Vinny is that you think there's going to be some regression that's going to come, and he continues to rake. And the one thing that's most striking about Vinny is he's become kind of the face of the franchise in less than a year. He is, I think the Royals social media and department just loves him, and rightfully so. I went to the Royals rally back at the end of January, and they had, a player panel, and Vinny and Bobby Witt Jr. was also on it. And Vinny P was just the one that was kind of commanding the show. The fans love him. He obviously loves being in Kansas City. So just from a personal standpoint, that he's very endearing in that end. But just from everything about his approach is just really something to behold. I mean, he had a higher walk rate than K rate last year in the major leagues. He continued to show off some incredible power. He had a very high percentage of at bats where defenses shifted on him, and he actually posted a higher WOBA against the shift than defenses that did not, which shows that, like, hey, it doesn't matter what you do against him defensively, though his quality of contact on balls is going to continue to carry him. And he's also shown that he can handle the position defensively. So, I totally can see him winning the batting title, especially with the shift. It's like, hey, more balls will fall. And he's a guy that I can see hit high 300s while still hitting for power. And with that being said, it's like he can be a dark horse MVP candidate. If the Royals somehow surprise, you got to say, like, the reason for that is because of Vinny Pasquantino. I mean, at the end of the day. And so I think there's a lot to be excited about. And I think he's, without a doubt, they talk about extension candidates. There's been really three names that have been thrown out: Bobby Witt Jr., Brady Singer, and of course, Vinny Pasquantino, and that just shows what kind of, like, how much the organization thinks about him.
Yeah, gotta love it. Not a bad thing for an 11th round draft pick just a few years ago. And I'm glad that you think that there's a possibility that batting champ can happen. And some people think I'm crazy for that hot take, but I think that's not bad, especially when you're talking about a left-handed power hitter who can hit for contact, and we're going to that shift restriction. I think we're going to see some left-handers really do some big things, and I think Vinny screams that. He's going to his age 26 season, and yeah, I mean, come on, bring an extension, Kansas City. I think you have the young core, go for it. Let's continue on with this young core, and let's talk about the other guy you just talked about that was in that Royals rally, and that's the first round pick, second overall pick in 2019, same year as that 11th rounder Pasquantino, but Bobby Witt Jr. Now he's going into his age 23 season. He's still young. Extensions definitely need to happen for this guy, but he has seen a full season under his belt now, has a full year of service time. Even though you talk about the possibility of Pasquantino kind of taking over that said name of the franchise, I still think Bobby Witt's the dude. He's still the guy. What's your thoughts about him in his second full season for the Royals?
Yeah, and I would probably say, honestly, yeah, Vinny Pasquantino has the most personality and he's the most eager to talk. But I think you're right. Bobby is the dude, and there's a very dude-esque, aura whenever he's there. Like when he was about to speak, it was, I don't like to make this reference a lot because I'm not like the biggest football fan, but it's very much like Patrick Mahomes. Like fans, like all the fans are just gravitating towards him everywhere he goes. and he's one of those guys. He likes to sign autographs. He's not going to be as eager to talk necessarily as like Vinny, but he doesn't shy away from it. He's very composed. He's very mature for his age. Like, you don't get the vibe that he's a 23-year-old kid who, played professional baseball out of high school. He feels a lot more like that. And you could tell that the other teammates really respect him and look up to him. Even in the Royals rally, they were giving the commentator a hard time, saying, hey, Bobby Witt Jr. is the best player here. This is the guy who should be talking right now, and rightfully so. And he had a great rookie year. The problem is like there was a really good rookie class. You had Julio Rodriguez and Adley Rutschman and Jeremy Pena and Stephen Kwan. And any other year, Bobby Witt is either finishing in second or maybe winning it. But because that class was so loaded, but I also saw Bobby making so many adjustments. And I think something that's not talked about enough was the hamstring injury he had in late July, and how Mike Matheny and the Royal staff didn't handle it the best. They kind of, well, is he going to play? Is he not? Instead of just putting him on the IL and let him recover. I think if he had a chance to really recover more, I think he would have recovered more quickly, and we would have saw a stronger finish. And you kind of saw his power numbers kind of dipped after the injury too. So I'm really excited to see what he can do over a full healthy season. Defense is going to be a concern. The advanced metrics did not like his defense at shortstop. The Royals are kind of saying, hey, he's our shortstop for now. So that's going to be really interesting. They did hire a new infield coach, Jose Alguacil, who was formerly with the Giants and the Nationals. So I think, and they had really good results with him. So I think they're really hoping that Alguacil will have a good effect on Bobby to help him be a much better defensive infielder in 2023.
Would love to see that, his defensive improve. Obviously, that's something that it would be a huge thing for the Royals because, like I said, I think he is the dude. We're getting some big Lebowski feels on this podcast today, and I'm all about it. Another guy I want to talk about, and I know there's plenty we can talk about this youth movement, but I think he's not talked about enough. We did a Royals offseason picture about a month and a half ago, myself and Sean Doyle on the show. And there was plenty of comments that came in because we didn't talk about MJ Melendez enough. And that made me really push and do a lot of research and look more on him. I remember obviously watching him play last year, but he's overshadowed by Bobby Witt and Vinny Pasquantino. And you look at his performance and what he's done, and you can really see that his potential is not even close to where he is right now. I think he possibly could be just as good as the two we mentioned beforehand. I think he has some amazing versatility. Fangraphs have him right now as the starting DH. I find that quite interesting. What's your thoughts on MJ Melendez? I think this guy is an interesting player.
And I agree. And I think that he is one that is going to sneak up on us. You look at some of the metrics from Fangraphs, 99 WRC plus, 217 batting average, but you also see 258 BABIP. And he had an exit velocity of average exit velocity of 90.2 miles per hour. So he's obviously getting pretty above average hard hit contact. And again, if you look at the StatCast metrics, he was a guy that was hurt a lot by the shift last year. So he's a guy that I see really benefiting from the shift rules. Just being a fan who had partial season tickets and seeing a lot of games, it did feel like there was a lot of balls that MJ hit, and it just went right into the shift when he wasn't. But, he started to grow a lot as a hitter, going more opposite field. And, I think he's the kind of guy who he's not going to hit 260. He's not going to hit 300, but he can give you 240, 250, and he can give you 25, 30 home runs and a lot of production, and also some great production on the base paths. I mean, he was actually the leadoff hitter for the Royals most of the year, even though his primary position was catcher. I think one of the things that hurt Melendez's reputation last year was the defense. He was kind of moved around a lot last year. He struggled in his first year in catcher, not just on a framing end, but just blocking end as well. That was a little bit surprising because his reports were so good. So I don't know if it was just an adjustment issue. But, he played a lot of outfield, and he had never played outfield until he got to the majors. And so I think this year, after a full off season and probably a full spring training of him playing the outfield, I think he'll see more outfield this year, and I think he'll be a lot better. I could see a situation like a Dalton Varsho where where he starts off as a kind of a mediocre catcher, moves to the outfield, and he's so athletic that he eventually becomes a very good outfielder. And I see the production being very similar. I think he might be a couple years away from that 2022 Varsho that we saw. But, if you look at where Varsho was in 2020, he struggled during that shortened season. So I think Melendez is even a little bit ahead of where Dalton Varsho was, kind of at the same points in their careers.
That's a fantastic comparison. I like that with the versatility of the catcher and moving over. I like that. Awesome. That's something I wasn't thinking about. All right. We talked about Melendez playing catcher, but obviously Father Time, Salvador Perez. Is Time going to catch up to Salvi, or is he another 30 home run candidate in 2023?
I think he is. I mean, I think, for all the advanced metrics that we see and how he hits baseballs, it's like, it seems like he's the kind of hitter that, as long as he's making contact with it, the power is always going to be legitimate. I'm really interested to see what Q and the coaching staff will do in terms of preserving his health. The fact of the matter is Salvi's a gamer. And if Salvi wants to play 162 games, Salvi's going to want to play 162 games. And I think that was the one thing like Matheny had a hard time with, was when you had veterans like Salvi or Witt saying, hey, I want to play every day. Maybe it wasn't the best decision. Maybe they weren't 100%. Maybe they could have used the days off. But Matheny, being a player's manager kind of guy, was kind of like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. I think Q is a lot more analytical. They kind of see the whole picture. They see the forest instead of the trees. And I know that they have the backing from Picola to do that. So I think you're going to see Salvi rest a little bit more. I think you'll see have him be on the DH a little bit more. And I wouldn't be surprised to see him having those days off a little bit more, because, he is older and, and he's plays a position that's very demanding, and he's a big guy. That's going to be a really hard toll on his body. But they're going to need him to produce 30 home runs and 100 plus RBI and hopefully hit 250, 260, because he's the heart of that lineup, and he's the most guaranteed thing they have right now, other than Vinny. So I'm hoping that he has another healthy season, because he's a lot of fun and he brings a lot to this lineup.
I'm not breaking any news here on this podcast, not saying he's going to retire, but if you look at last season with Yadier Molina for the Cardinals doing his farewell, and how it felt and how it's already feeling seeing a different catcher by watching Cardinals games, how is it going to feel when eventually Salvador Perez is no longer the Royals lineup, the Royals squad, whether it's even catching or just not there at all?
I think that's going to be really interesting, because Salvi is really the last piece of that 2015 World Series team. Witt wasn't really part of it, so that doesn't really count, but it's kind of seems that, he's kind of one of the last remnants of, hey, like this was like the glory years, and now with Dayton Moore gone, so that's also another big thing. So I think that'll be really tough. I think as much as it'll be sad not seeing him there, I think there's part of it that the Royals need to do is just simply move on in some cases. I'm not saying that Salvi needs to move on anytime soon, but I do think the Royals need to say, hey, let's quit trying to catch lightning in a bottle again, which will happen in 2014, 2015, and try to build a new model of a small market team that can be successful year after year, because it's tough for this franchise. Before they made the playoffs in 2014, they hadn't made a playoffs in 30 years. And in a town like Kansas City with 2 Super Bowls and in like the last 5 years and MLS championships and KU basketball, it's like fans tune out. And it's a shame, because I think the Royals offer a lot, but there's a pressure to win, and it'd be nice to see the Royals build a consistent winner, but you can't keep doing that if you're saying, hey, we're going to try to keep building it like 2014 and 2015.
Excellent point. Really good way of saying that one. All right, let's talk about the pitching rotation here. I think this is a really interesting one. You talk about the youth movement in the actual lineup. That's not the case in the rotation. Zach Greinke comes back. He's going to be age 40 by the time this season's over. Jordan Lyles comes over from Baltimore after being an absolute inning eater for the Orioles to help them really turn into that dark horse candidate last season, just missing the playoffs. And then Ryan Yarbrough, other ODU guy, by the way, if you didn't know, comes in to be your left-handed in your rotation. You still got Brady Singer, as you mentioned, and Brad Keller. Not a bad 5 I'm sure I'm missing another guy. I'm sure, like every team, there's going to be probably a 6-man rotation to start the season. But what is your thoughts about this rotation? It's a lot of age here. So is this a rotation that you see going on with the Royals for a full season in 2023?
I mean, I think we know that Greinke will probably be there for a full season as long as he's healthy. I think Greinke is pretty much going to be retirement or bust at this point. So because I'm sure he could have got something a little bit more with another team. Obviously, there's a demand for pitchers, and yet Greinke didn't seem like he was negotiating with anybody else but Kansas City. Lyles will be an interesting one just because he is on a 2-year deal and he is an innings eater. But they got him at a pretty good deal at about $8.5 million per AAV. So it's one of those things that if Lyles does really well, with the market rate being at least $10 million for even like pitchers that are kind of mediocre, maybe Lyles gains some trade interest, especially if he starts to show that he's kind of trending upward. Yarborough's on a short deal. He'll be an interesting one because I'm not sure what his role will be. He spent a lot of time in relief last year. Just by the nature of Q coming from Tampa, it'll be really interesting if they get creative with somebody like Yarborough and Keller, maybe kind of pair them with maybe Keller starting off as an opener and Yarborough coming in right after, or vice versa. I think that you're going to see that at some point, especially with so much depth in the rotation. Not necessarily good depth or proven depth, but there is depth. It's like you have Daniel Lynch, Chris Bubish, John Heasley, Carlos Hernandez. Those are all guys who saw starts last year. So they have guys who can take the ball on the hill. It'll just be a question of who is going to earn that and how they're going to do it. And then, so I think the starting rotation will be really interesting in that sense. I think Greinke, Lyles, and Singer are solidified, but I could see the last 2 spots really going up in the air, not just during spring training, but even like after a couple months in the season and they get really creative.
All right. You've also seen a couple offseason moves. Mondesi getting traded to the Red Sox. That was a big one. I'm sure you're really hurt by Ryan O'Hearn getting DFA'd. And then, of course, Aroldis Chapman getting signed. I think that was one of the most interesting signings in my opinion, in all of baseball, because I didn't see it coming. I'll be completely honest. I didn't see that him going to Kansas City. A lot of people are already ruling saying it's a half-year rental. There's no way he finishes the season with the Kansas City Royals. I mean, however you want to say it. But regardless, this bullpen looks pretty good now. When you see names like Aroldis Chapman and Amir Garrett and Scott Barlow, those are some pretty good names to sit in your bullpen in Kansas City.
I agree. And I think that's something that I think the Royals are trying to do. I think we saw what really carried Baltimore last year was they had a very good bullpen, and they had a bullpen that had a lot of guys who overachieved, like kind of Jorge Lopez really coming out and having a great year until he got traded. And I think the Royals are trying to do that as well. They've, getting Chapman, I know from a fan perspective, it's a tough one just because of his history, not just with the off the field stuff, but even in the clubhouse stuff, there's been some concerns there. But, if the Royals kind of said they acquired him because they felt like they saw something mechanical that they feel like they can adjust with him. And so, if you have him and Barlow at the top, that gives a lot of potential. And then we saw Dylan Coleman take a really big step up last year and became one of their big setup men down the stretch. And then you also have guys like Josh Stalmont, who kind of was dealing with injury, but was really good in 2021. Josh Taylor, who was acquired in the Mondesi deal, was pretty good in 2021, but missed most of the last year due to injury. And then you have some other guys such as like Amir Garrett, who's looking for a bounce back. Richard Lovelady, who comes back looking for a bounce back. And as well as Carlos Hernandez, could he look better in the bullpen? So there's a lot of potential there, and there's a lot of depth there. And I could see them really utilizing the options like in those first couple months, and essentially kind of having a really extended bullpen with a lot of the other guys in Omaha. So it's going to be, that's going to be a strength. Hopefully it pays off.
The Mondesi trade was something that if you haven't paid attention to Royals baseball, you might be a little bit surprised. If you remember a few years back, he seemed to be a guy that was a staple about being a part of the new young core. Obviously, injuries got in the way from that, and that's why he was shipped off to Boston. Dropkick Murphys, I guess I should say it out loud. However, with Mondesi, you feel like that is not the end of the Kansas City Royals with their trade buzz. Obviously, a guy like Nick Prado could be on the move. He stirs around in a lot of off seasons, just mix, if you will. Are there any more moves on the horizon for the Royals? I hate to really bring this up about a franchise when we haven't even haven't even played baseball games yet, but it just seems like they're not done.
And I don't think they are either. Hunter Dozier was a guy that was getting a lot of trade talk this winter. He's coming off 2 rough years. One was kind of injury related. 2022, he was fine in the first half and just kind of nosedive a bit in the second half. But then, he was a name that was being floated around along with Michael A. Taylor, and they were able to pull off a deal for Michael A. Taylor, but it didn't happen for Dozier. One of the things that we kind of feel like as a Royals community that a Dozier deal could get done if there's an injury in spring training, like if maybe somebody like a starting third baseman gets hurt, Dozier might be that next guy that gets traded. And it's not that Dozier doesn't have potential. He's still under contract for 2 more years, but it's just that there's a really big sentiment that probably Bobby Witt is going to move to third base, which might be a better fit for him. And then Maikel Garcia, who is related to a former Royals shortstop, Alcides Escobar, as well as Atlanta's Ronald Acuna Jr. And he had a really breakout year last year in AA and AAA. He made his debut. He had a fantastic Winter League campaign where he was arguably one of the best hitters for a team that made the postseason in the Winter League. There's a lot of potential there for Maikel Garcia. That maybe he could slide in as a starting shortstop and move Bobby over, which means that Dozier probably has to go. But again, I don't think they're going to force that. I think they want to see, can Bobby still play shortstop? But I would say Hunter Dozier is a guy that's probably already on the trade block. And as soon as there becomes a need, he's probably going to be one of the first calls that you're going to hear about.
Interesting. You talk about Garcia. Obviously, youth movements come in waves, and we can say that with this Pasquantino, Bobby Witt, things like that. You consider that the first wave. Before I get your predictions of what we think the Kansas City Royals are going to be in 2023, any other prospects on the horizon or some you think that we should really be paying attention to in the Royals organization? Definitely more of a spotlight this year, as if you get MLB TV, you are also getting the minor league package involved this year. Big things. So I encourage a lot of people to watch way more minor league baseball. What are some names that, off the top of your head, that you think we should be paying attention to?
Gavin Cross is going to be the biggest one. He was a first-round draft pick out of Virginia Tech. He's kind of polarizing among prospect experts. You have some prospect experts, like, for example, I believe MLB Pipeline ranked him as their 62nd best prospect in baseball. And then you had Fangraphs listing him completely off the top 100. He's kind of one of those guys who's probably more floor than ceiling. He probably is a guy who can move quickly, but he did really well in low A Columbia in his short stint. So he's a guy that I'm really looking forward to. And then also pitchers Ben Cadurna and Frank Mazzucato. Keith Law was very complimentary of those two and their development, which is really surprising because Keith Law is usually pretty negative about the Royals. So it's like to hear positive stuff from Keith Law is whoa. So, I mean, I think if the pitching development is doing what it's supposed to do, those are two guys who could take big steps up. They were kind of cold weather pitching prospects. So it made sense why the Royals kind of progress them slow after they get drafted them in 2021. So I could see them being a breakout. And then, of course, Garcia, I really can't say enough of this guy. I know that some people will look at him, in 2021, I think he only hit like 2 or 3 homers for the whole year. And some people think he's just kind of a hit first infielder like a Nicky Lopez, but he also was his body hadn't grown out yet. And if you look at where his body was in 2020 or 2021 and where it is now, he's gotten a lot bigger and more muscular, and it shows off in the bat. And so he's a guy that I think is going to has some real star potential that could really come out of nowhere in 2023.
Love it. Love it. All right. 65 and 97 last year in 2022 for the Kansas City Royals. That was last place in the AL Central by 1 game, 27 games out of the first place behind Cleveland Guardians. Where do you see them end up in the AL Central this year, 1 through 5, and then 65 wins? Do you see that over or under for 2023?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are kind of penciling them for last place. I think they finish 4th. I really do. I think this team is better than Detroit. Detroit has done a lot more blowing up than Kansas City has, and Detroit has a lot more injury issues than Kansas City has, especially in the rotation. Just with Casey Mize and Tariq Skubal, those guys being really unclear of where they're at. I know Eduardo Rodriguez missed some time last year, and even guys like Austin Meadows, missed considerable time last year. So I feel like there's a lot of injury issues with the Tigers, and I get why some people might think that they'll be better just because they have a new GM from San Francisco, but I think they're probably a year away from really taking the next step. And I think it's going to be close, though. I mean, I don't, I think this is Cleveland's division to win, but I'm not necessarily sold on the moves the White Sox did. And while I think the Twins are going to be better, are they substantially better than they were last year? I mean, they're better, but I'm not sure they're substantially better. So I think I could see that the Royals could finish fourth place in this division.
Are you excited or upset, skeptical about playing the division 13 times instead of 19?
I like it from a fan perspective. I mean, just as somebody who has a partial season tickets, it's like this year, it's like, hey, I get to see a lot more teams that, normally I wouldn't see. So I think that's a good on that end. In terms of a competitive end, I feel like this is a year you'd want to play the division more because, like I said, it's like I'm not really sold on the White Sox as much as I love Grifol. I love what his press conference and the energy he brings, but I don't think that roster got better, and I'm not sure that they're going to be better, especially with them getting older. So I wish it's those opponents like, man, I wish we could play Detroit more, play Chicago more. Even maybe Minnesota, Cleveland, it's not like this. It's not like the AL East, it's not like the AL West, where those teams are head and shoulders at the top of the division. It's a very even division. So losing out on 6 games feels like a bit of a bummer. And that puts even more pressure on the Royals to really take care of business in the Central if they want to even surprise at all in 2023.
Kevin O'Brien, everyone, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Row Report by the OK Baseball Podcast. We are just getting through these team previews. We're flying through them. And what a good way to start the AL Central with the Kansas City Old Dominion Royals. I absolutely love it, Kevin. Let everyone know where they can find you, your Twitter, your website, all the things you write for. Go ahead. The mic is yours, my friend.
Yeah. So again, thanks again for having me on. You can find me on Twitter at Royal Report Kev. On Twitter, you can also find my blog at theroyalsreporter.com, and as well as I contribute for pitcherlist.com. Primarily contribute to the Going Deep section, as well as the fantasy baseball section with the weekly batters box column once the season starts. So those are some places where you can find my work.
I won my first ever fantasy baseball league last year, and the first time I ever played. And I can say that I read a couple of your columns last year. So I'll give a little bit of nod to you, my friend. There was no cash prize money, so I guess my donation will just be in thanks. That'll wrap it up for this episode of the Row Report here at the OK Baseball Podcast. We'll be back here, more on the feed. Just keep looking forward. Hit that refresh like you do Twitter. There's probably be a new episode up right after this one because we have so much coming at you at the OK Baseball Podcast. 30 teams will be previewed, of course, in our other daily content here on the podcast feed. Look for us on the YouTube channels as well. Hit subscribe. We're over 300 subscribers now, so thank you so much. Keep that up. We'll be back here with another episode soon. Take care.